What up, Pittsburgh Steelers fans? It is Matty P here with another Steelers War Room episode for all the Steelers fans out there. It's been a little while since we did a War Room series podcast. Apologies, we've kept it a little bit light. There's been a lot going on for Mark and I personally and in our other jobs, but keen to finally bring this one to you. One I've been planning for a little while, about a sort of 10 days or so. So glad I can finally bring it to you guys. But basically, looking at Levi Wallace, who I believe is the unsung hero of the Steelers secondary, but definitely cornerback position. And there's been a lot of talk this offseason about the acquisition of Patrick Peterson, a lot of talk about the drafting of Joey Porter Jr., the drafting of Corey Trice as well in the 7th round. I'm a big fan of both those guys. They also got Shannon Sullivan coming into play slot. But Levi Wallace seems to be the name that's left out, and he had a sneaky good year last year, a sneaky good year. So that's what I wanted to focus on with a really quick podcast for you and YouTube show for you today. So we're going to look at PFF. Those now PFF stats. Some people love them, some people hate them. Fine, but they do something that other people don't do, and they do a lot more around snaps and grades, and it's really easy to see that. We'll also look at some Stat Head, which is the paid-for subscription with Pro Football Reference. Don't want to go too heavy for you. We'll try and keep this light and sweet. So, especially as we head into training camp, because as I said, I think fans will start to see the importance of Levi Wallace to the Steelers' defense and secondary, particularly as potentially an older head in the room, but really the one that knows the Steelers' defense the best when you think about the cornerbacks that they've got right now. You could say James Pierre's been in the system, but I believe he's a practice squad guy in one of those sort of more veteran spots right now. So Levi Wallace has played all over 3,750 snaps in his career in the NFL. 709 of those came last year. His defensive grade was actually, like, if you look at it, one of the worst in his career, according to PFF. But his run defense was the highest of his career. His tackling was the highest of his career. His coverage grade was low. Now, when you actually look at the stats in Pro Football Reference and you look at some of the deeper numbers there, this coverage grade's probably unfair. And this is where people start to criticize PFF particularly. So that's another thing to note from that regard. But the key thing when I really look at Levi Wallace's season last year was that he had 4 interceptions, only allowed 3 touchdowns. And we'll get to that again a little bit later on in this pod. But he has only had 11 interceptions. Pro Football Reference says he's had 10, but 11 in his career. Now, Pro Football Reference might be counting that difference between in-season versus playoffs. But 4 of those came last year. So he's got at least 40% of his interceptions, or certainly more than a third of his interceptions, came last year for the Pittsburgh Steelers, his first season with the team. Now, he only allowed 3 touchdowns. He had 4 pass breakups, according to PFF, but we'll have a look at that versus with the Pro Football Reference as well. Only allowed about 55% completion in terms of receptions on the targets. He had 71 according to PFF. Again, the numbers are a little bit different when we go to Pro Football Reference, but that's fine. He lined up at corner, 633 snaps out of his 709 snaps. Played a little bit in the box, played a little bit in the slot. I think you could see him a little bit more in the slot this year, particularly if Shannon Sullivan is taking a while to get used to being a Pittsburgh Steeler, and particularly because they're going to look to use Joey Porter and Corey Trice in some of those sets. I think you might even see Patrick Peterson in the slot a little bit, but he's definitely going to be really important in the nickel. Really important in the nickel. Levi Wallace will be, I think, for this team. So yeah, that I'm kind of actually quite excited about. As I say, unsung hero based on what we saw in 2022. Now, you kind of go at 4 interceptions, so what? Well, in the league leaders in interceptions last year was actually kind of a bit of a down year when it comes to interceptions. Minkah Fitzpatrick was up there with 6, the highest Steeler on the list. Then you had CJ Gardner-Johnson, Tariq Woolen, the rookie, Justin Simmons, the free safety out at Denver. Jalen Petrie had 5 there. There are a couple of blokes. Patrick Peterson was one of the ones that had 5. But when you go down and look at 4, Levi Wallace is one with 4. So there was a lot of talk about Cameron Sutton leaving, and I think there's been a lot of talk about Sutton. When we picked up Peterson, people kind of started to forget about that a little bit, and I think people have, particularly but you can feel safer in that because you've got Levi Wallace there. So the Steelers technically have 3 guys in the top 30, really in the 16 people that had 4 interceptions last year. That Steelers have got 3 people in the top 30 interception takers, I guess, if you for want of a better term, in the league last year. They've now got them on the roster in the secondary, 2 of them at the cornerback position. That's incredible. That's really good, especially for a team that has a defensive coordinator in Terrell Austin, who is also known as a secondary coach. And to think that they've acquired a guy like Joey Porter Jr., acquired a guy that's versatile like Corey Trice, and it allows them to have a guy like Keanu Neal come closer to the box because they've got more guys that they can spread around in the secondary, including you start to talk about Kazi, because he's another guy that can fit into the slot or even potentially playing in a big nickel set. Definitely, he's really important in the dime. So that's kind of important there when you look at those interceptions. I think that's pretty cool in how the Steelers have improved in that regard. And then they're going to need that as well. The pass rush the Steelers have too, really important. You want to be able to put pressure on the quarterback and then capitalize on the mistakes. And that's how they're kind of setting themselves up. So I thought the other cool thing would be to do is to compare the season last year of Levi Wallace to Patrick Peterson, Cameron Sutton, Arthur Mollett, Kazi, and Shannon Sullivan. Obviously, unfortunately, with the state head, the way it works, you can't compare college to the pros. But these are the guys that are in the Steelers secondary that are guys that are either going to be playing in the slot, and KZ could be that guy. Cameron Sutton, who was a key guy for them that left, and then looking at what Patrick Peterson did last year. Now, the State have actually done this cool thing now when the green basically denotes who was the leader in their field or in that stat regard. Now, you see with Levi Wallace didn't lead in anything in terms of he only played 15 games. He had solo tackles, he didn't lead in that, but he did lead. He was second in interceptions, and that's a really key thing against all these cornerbacks. Patrick Peterson had 5. That's kind of the difference. That's kind of hard for me to do the comparison, so we'll scroll down a little bit. When you look at it, as I said, interceptions, we all know Peterson got 5, Wallace 4, Sutton had 3, Kazi 2, Mollett 1. Mollett had that one. I think it was against Cleveland. But Mollett had 2 sacks, a little bit different to them all. You look at, in terms of tackles, Levi Wallace was further down on that list, but you got to look at where he plays in the secondary. But in terms of pass defenses, remember we talked about the pass breakups, him having 11 according to PFF. Well, according to this, he has 13. Sutton had 15. Patrick Peterson had 15. Now, these are sort of top line sort of stats, and you sit there and you're like, well, hang on, what does this necessarily mean? I mean, this is just one number. Obviously, then we talk about interceptions. That's why I like to drill down, and it's one of the best things when you're looking at secondary players in Pro Football Reference. They do have a section around advanced defense for all defensive players, but it's really good when you're looking at the secondary. So we know, as I said, they talked about on Pro Football Reference 54.9% allowing completion. Bit of a different number here. Sorry, not Pro Football Reference. That was PFF. This is Pro Football Reference. Because they had 71 targets that went Wallace's way, I trust Pro Football Reference more. They said there were 77 targets that were thrown Levi Wallace's way. He allowed 41. That's completion percent of only 53.2%. That's huge, right? And he's the same age as Cameron Sutton. Cameron Sutton's the lowest on this list with a 47.9 completion percentage allowance. Now, yards, Levi Wallace allowed a lot more at 650. That was actually, I think that's second on this list. Now, Sutton had about 388. Mollett had a bit less. But this is the thing you've got to look at. And then also yards per completion, that meant was 15.9. Now, and that was the highest out of all the players that were playing last year in the Steelers cornerbacks and secondary room that we can compare, or the new guy in Patrick Peterson as well. Patrick Peterson had the most. He allowed 700 yards last year. He was playing all over the place in a much poorer defense, or at least much poorer secondary than what the Steelers had. But you've got to remember when you look at yards per completion, this is really important, and a lot of people don't look at this, is the average depth of target when targeted as a defender. So depending on how deep you're set off the wide receiver or whoever's receiving that football, the target's going their way. Levi Wallace, 13 yards back, so only allowing the 15-point yards. That's a net gain of like the 2.9 yards, right? Whereas Cameron Sutton, allowed a very limited amount, 11.1, and that's why you saw him allow a really poor, not a lot of yards. Big difference. Patrick Peterson allowed 13 yards per completion, average up to target of 11. So kind of almost the same numbers. Again, Levi Wallace is slightly outside of that. KZ allowed 11, so he had more yardage that he allowed than Levi Wallace. Same with Sullivan, same with Morlett. Now remember Morlett, they have let go, so that's one key thing to think about. Missed tackles. I like to judge secondary guys on this. It's the one area that Minka did improve a bit last year, and he needed to because he had like a 13%. Obviously, it's harder when you're playing at a deep safety role. But Levi Wallace only missed 7.7% of his tackles. That's pretty good with the number of snaps that he playing in 15 games, and having 77 targets thrown his way, which was the second most in this list other than Patrick Peterson. It also shows how good Patrick Peterson's numbers are, given his age at 32, only allowing 700 yards, less than 60% completion. It's pretty good. It's pretty good from all these guys, really, when you think about it. And it's pretty exciting to think of what this Steelers secondary could be in 2023. Now, when you look at the defensive snaps overall, as I said, Levi Wallace 709 versus like 1105 Patrick Peterson. His numbers are just unbelievable. It's so good for this defense. But it also depended on what scheme Levi Wallace was playing in. I think he had an injury. He was out a couple of games as well. No, he mustn't be. Yeah, 15. Yeah, because he hadn't done the 15 games. But as I say, unsung hero, because there's the draftees getting the praise. There's Patrick Peterson getting the praise, and well-deserved. He's a veteran in that room. Some people talk about Pierre's. Some people are questioning Sullivan, but you pretty much know he's going to be the slot guy, or at least get the chance to lose that position. Levi Wallace is the unsung guy, and he could prove really important. He does know how to get interceptions. He does know how to make plays. He did that for Buffalo in 2021 as well, when Buffalo sort of really developed and came on. So that's the other thing that I'm really excited by, is that I think in the clutch, Levi Wallace is going to be a really strong addition to this team in 2023. He's going to be a strong contributor, and that's kind of what I'm sort of excited to see. He had one of his career best years last year, and that's something that Steelers fans should be excited about. His most interceptions, his most pass defenses. He had a decent number of tackles, and that's something that we should really be happy about as Steelers fans, as he comes into his own. Particularly because he doesn't have to be the number one corner on this team. He doesn't have to be the number two corner. He has to be an awesome third corner, and he's going to be an absolutely key contributor. But with that, that's going to wrap up this episode of Steelers War Room. Just wanted to talk about the unsung hero, potentially, or definitely from last year, I think potentially as well in 2023, Levi Wallace. You can catch Mark and I tonight on tonight's show at about 6 p.m. Eastern Time. We will be going live with the next episode of TDU Boys. But as always, go Steelers.